You think you can just walk up these steps because the gate was left open? This is a $60 million machine, not a public bus. That was the last mistake Captain Richard Sterling ever made. He looked at the woman in the faded denim jacket standing at the foot of the Gulfstream GX-50 OR and saw only one thing: someone who didn't belong. He didn't see the doctorate in aerospace engineering. He didn't see the majority shareholder of the very airline he flew for. And he certainly didn't see the pink slip that was about to hit him harder than a Category 5 hurricane. This is the story of how an arrogant veteran pilot insulted a black woman at boarding, only to realize moments later. She was the one signing his paycheck. The tarmac at Teterboro Airport in New Jersey was shimmering under the hazy July heat. Heat waves danced off the asphalt, distorting the horizon where the Manhattan skyline stood like a jagged row of grey teeth in the distance. It was the playground of the elite, the silent hub where billionaires, tech moguls and A-list celebrities moved in shadows, avoiding the chaotic hoi polloi of JFK or Newark. Captain Richard Sterling adjusted his epaulets, admiring the 4 gold bars on his shoulder in the reflection of the cockpit window. He was a man of routine, and that routine was built on a foundation of unshakable superiority. With 30 years of flying experience, first in the Air Force, then commercial, and finally the creme de la creme, private aviation, Richard believed he was the god of the sky. He was tall, with silver fox hair that was perfectly coiffed, and a jawline that had survived 3 divorces. "Sarah," Richard barked into the galley, not bothering to turn around. "Is the catering secure? The manifest says Mr. Thorne is bringing a guest. I don't want any cheap champagne on this bird. We are flying the new owner of Apex Jet. Standard, Sarah." Sarah, a young flight attendant with patience far beyond her years, poked her head out. "Yes, Captain. The Dom Perignon is chilled. The caviar is on ice. Everything is perfect." "It better be," Richard grumbled, checking his Breitling watch. "Management has been cryptic about this takeover. Rumor is the new CEO is some tech whiz kid or an heir. Whoever it is, they better respect the cockpit. I don't do fly-alongs and I don't do chatting." He descended the air stairs of the Gulfstream GEORTAR, tail number N770AP, to do his final walk-around. The jet was a masterpiece of engineering, a sleek silver bullet capable of flying near the speed of sound. It was his baby. He treated the plane with more affection than he had ever treated his own children. As he rounded the nose gear, checking the tires, movement caught his eye near the FBO, fixed base operator gate. A woman was walking across the tarmac toward the jet. Richard squinted. She didn't look like a passenger. She certainly didn't look like an owner. She was a black woman, perhaps in her early 30s, wearing a pair of loose-fitting cargo pants, a vintage NASA t-shirt, and a denim jacket draped over her arm. She carried a battered leather messenger bag and wore noise-cancelling headphones around her neck. Her hair was pulled back in long, neat braids. She wasn't being escorted by the ground crew. There was no black SUV with tinted windows pulling up to the stairs. She was just walking. Richard's lip curled. Security at Teterboro was usually tighter than this. He assumed she was either part of the cleaning crew that had arrived late, or perhaps a personal assistant sent to fetch something, though she looked too casual even for that. He finished his inspection of the landing gear and moved to block the stairs, crossing his arms over his chest. He stood like a sentry, his aviator sunglasses hiding the disdain in his eyes. The woman approached, her pace steady. She looked up at the plane, her eyes scanning the fuselage, lingering on the winglets with a look of intense scrutiny. She pulled a tablet out of her bag and tapped something on the screen. When she got within 10 feet, Richard cleared his throat loud enough to be heard over the distant whine of a Cessna taking off. "Can I help you?" Richard asked, though the tone suggested he wanted to do anything but help. The woman stopped. She looked up from her tablet, sliding her sunglasses down her nose. She had striking eyes, sharp and intelligent, but currently clouded with the fatigue of travel. "Good morning," she said, her voice calm. "I'm here for the 10 a.m. departure to London." Richard let out a short, incredulous laugh. He looked around theatrically, as if searching for a hidden camera. "The 10 a.m. to London? Miss, I think you're lost. The commercial terminals are about 20 miles that way, at Newark. This is a private facility." "I know where I am," she said, taking a step closer. "I'm looking for Captain Sterling." "You found him," Richard said, puffing his chest out. "And I'm telling you, you're in the wrong place. We aren't expecting—" He looked her up and down, his eyes lingering on her sneakers. "Support staff. The catering is already loaded, and the cleaning crew finished an hour ago." The woman blinked, a small, tight smile playing on her lips. It wasn't a smile of amusement. It was the smile of someone calculating the structural integrity of a bridge before deciding to blow it up. "I'm not support staff," she said softly. "My name is Alicia. I believe I'm on the manifest." Richard sighed, the kind of exaggerated sigh a parent gives a toddler who refuses to eat their peas. "Listen, honey. The manifest is for the owner of this aircraft and his associates. It's not a list you just get added to. Now, I don't know who let you through the gate. Probably that new kid at the front desk who can't read a badge. But you need to turn around and go back before I call security. You are violating federal aviation regulations by being on this tarmac unauthorized." Alicia shifted her weight. "I assure you, I am authorized. If you just check your tablet—" "I don't need to check anything," Richard snapped, stepping down one step so he loomed over her. "I know my passengers. I fly industry titans, senators, oil tycoons. I don't fly—" He waved a hand vaguely in her direction. "Backpackers." "Backpackers," Alicia repeated, the word tasting dry in her mouth. "Look," Richard said, checking his watch again. "Mr. Thorne is going to be here any minute. He is a very important man. If he sees you loitering near his jet, he's going to be unhappy. And if he's unhappy, I'm unhappy. And you do not want to see me unhappy." "Mr. Thorne," Alicia said, her voice dropping an octave. "You're expecting a Mr. Thorne?" "Yes, the new owner. Now, shoo." Richard made a shooing motion with his hands, the ultimate gesture of dismissal. Alicia stood her ground. The heat coming off the tarmac was stifling, but her demeanor was ice cold. "Captain Sterling, I advise you to check the manifest one more time. Specifically, check the initials." "I have been flying for 30 years, Richard growled, his face reddening. "I have never been spoken to like this by someone who looks like they should be asking for a bus transfer. Get off my ramp. Now." He reached for the radio clipped to his belt. "Operations, this is Captain Sterling on N770 AP. I have an unauthorized individual on the tarmac refusing to vacate, requesting immediate security assistance." Alicia watched him make the call. She didn't flinch. She simply tapped her tablet again, closed the cover, and placed it back in her bag. "You really shouldn't have done that," she said quietly. "Watch me," Richard sneered. "They'll drag you out of here." The silence that followed was heavy. Richard stood on the stairs, acting as the gatekeeper to the heavens, while Alicia stood on the asphalt, the heat radiating through the soles of her sneakers. "You know," Alicia said, her voice conversational now, as if they were discussing the weather rather than an impending arrest. "I noticed you have a slight hydraulic leak on the left main gear strut. Just a weep, really, but with the pressure differential at 45,000 feet, that could become a problem. Richard scoffed. Excuse me? Are you a mechanic now, too? Stick to whatever it is you do. I did my walk around. The strut is fine. It's not fine, Alicia countered, pointing a slender finger toward the wheel well. There's a darker residue near the piston seal, and judging by the logbooks I reviewed last night, this aircraft has a history of seal degradation in colder climates. We're heading to London. It'll be cold up there. Richard's eyes narrowed. You reviewed the logbooks? What are you talking about? Those are confidential documents. He took a step down, his face inches from hers. The height difference was significant, but Alicia didn't back down. She held his gaze with a ferocity that unsettled him, though he wouldn't admit it. Who are you? Richard demanded, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. Are you corporate espionage? A reporter? I'm the person trying to board my plane, Alicia said, and you are the employee standing in my way. Your plane? Richard threw his head back and laughed, a harsh, barking sound. Lady, this jet costs $65 million. You're wearing a t-shirt that looks like you bought it at a thrift store. Do you have any idea how much fuel it takes just to start these engines? It costs more than you make in a year. I like this t-shirt, Alicia said, brushing a piece of lint off the NASA logo. It's vintage, and for your information, the G650ER burns approximately 450 gallons per hour at cruise, depending on the payload and altitude. But we're wasting fuel right now just running the APU while you stand here inflating your ego. Richard was stunned into silence for a split second. She knew the fuel burn rate, but he quickly dismissed it. Anyone could look up stats on Wikipedia. You've got a smart mouth, Richard spat. I don't care what you've memorized. You aren't getting on this jet. I decide who boards. That is the captain's authority, and I am designating you a security threat. At that moment, a sleek black Range Rover whipped around the corner of the hangar, flanked by a security patrol car. The tires screeched slightly as the convoy came to a halt near the jet. Richard smirked. There. That's either security for you or Mr. Thorne. Either way, your little charade is over. Two men in dark suits stepped out of the Range Rover. Richard straightened up, smoothing his tie, preparing to greet the real owner. He put on his best customer service smile, the one he reserved for people with a net worth over 9 figures. Mr. Thorne, Richard called out, descending the final steps to greet the men. Right on time. Apologies for the obstruction here. We have a confused individual who refuses to leave. Security is handling it. The first man in the suit paused. It was Marcus, the VP of Operations for Apex Aviation. He looked at Richard, then looked past him to Alicia. His face went pale. Captain Sterling, Marcus said, his voice tight. Step aside. It's under control, Marcus, Richard assured him, stepping in front of Alicia to block Marcus's view of her. Just some local riffraff. Probably hopped the fence. I've already called security to have her removed so we can get Mr. Thorne on board and depart. Marcus didn't look at Richard. He walked right around the pilot, ignoring him completely, and approached Alicia. To Richard's absolute horror, Marcus bowed his head slightly. Dr. Thorne, Marcus said, his tone dripping with deference and apology. I am so terribly sorry. I got held up at the gate with the new badging system. I hope you haven't been waiting long. Richard froze. The blood drained from his face so fast he felt dizzy. Dr. Thorne? Alicia looked at Marcus, then slowly shifted her gaze back to Richard. The look wasn't triumphant. It was clinically disappointed. I haven't been waiting long, Marcus, Alicia said calmly. But I have been educated. It seems Captain Sterling here was just explaining to me that I look like a backpacker and that I couldn't possibly afford the fuel to start the engines. Marcus closed his eyes, pain visible on his face. He turned slowly to face Richard. Captain Sterling. Richard's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. The manifest said A. Thorne, I assumed. I thought it was Arthur Thorne, her father. Arthur Thorne retired 3 months ago, Alicia said, stepping around Marcus to stand toe-to-toe with Richard again. He transferred all controlling interest of Apex Aviation and the private fleet to me. I am the new CEO. I am the owner of this aircraft, and you, Captain, are currently standing between me and my seat. Richard felt the world tilting. The woman he had just threatened to arrest, the woman he had called riffraff, was the boss. The big boss. The person who could end his career with a single phone call. Dr. Thorne, Richard stammered, his voice cracking. I had no idea. You weren't dressed, typically owner's dress. And without an escort. Stop, Alicia said. She held up a hand. Just stop. You judged me based on how I look. You assumed because I'm a black woman in sneakers, I must be the help or a trespasser. You didn't check my ID. You didn't ask for my name until I forced it on you. You just reacted. She stepped onto the first stair of the jet, the metal clanging softly. She turned back to look down at him. He seemed smaller now, shrunken inside his crisp uniform. We have a schedule to keep, Captain, she said coldly. We are going to London. You are going to fly this plane, because I don't have time to find a replacement pilot on a Saturday morning. But do not think for 1 second that this conversation is over. Get in the cockpit. Do your job. And if you speak to me with anything less than absolute professional precision for the next 7 hours, you'll be flying cargo planes in Alaska by Monday. She turned and disappeared into the cabin. Richard stood there, the summer heat beating down on him, but he felt freezing cold. Marcus glared at him. You better hope she's in a forgiving mood, Richard, Marcus hissed. Because she just acquired a reputation for cleaning house, and you just volunteered to be the dust. Richard swallowed hard, his hands shaking as he gripped the railing of the stairs. He had to fly 7 hours with the woman he'd just humiliated, enclosed in a metal tube at 45,000 feet. It was going to be the longest flight of his life. The cabin of the Gulfstream was a sanctuary of luxury. Cream-colored leather seats, walnut wood finishes, and the soft hum of the environmental control system. Sarah, the flight attendant, was already busy arranging fresh flowers in a vase. She looked up as Alicia entered, sensing the tension radiating off the new arrival. "Good morning, Mum," Sarah said, her smile genuine but tentative. She had heard the shouting outside. "May I take your jacket?" "Thank you, Sarah," Alicia said, handing over the denim jacket. She sank into the principal seat, the one usually reserved for her father. It felt comfortable, but the atmosphere was thick with unease. Up in the cockpit, the mood was funereal. Richard strapped himself into the left seat, his movements jerky and uncoordinated. His co-pilot, a younger man named David, was already running through the pre-flight checklist. David was everything Richard wasn't. Young, progressive, and keenly aware of the power dynamics at play. He had heard everything through the open cockpit window. "Door is secured," David said, keeping his eyes glued to the avionics screens. He didn't want to look at Richard. He was embarrassed for him. "Right. Checklist," Richard muttered. He tried to summon his usual commanding aura, but it was gone. He felt naked. Every time he reached for a switch, he pictured Alicia Thorne back there, judging his every move. She was an aerospace engineer. She knew the systems. She wasn't some distracted CEO sipping scotch. She was a technical expert. APU running, Richard said. Let's get the clearance. As they taxied out, Richard's mind raced. How do I fix this? He needed to smooth it over. Maybe once they were at cruise, he would go back and apologize. A charming, veteran pilot apology. He would explain he was just being protective of her asset. Yes, that was the angle. He was just being too good at security. The takeoff was rough. Richard's hands were sweaty, and he overcorrected on the rotation, causing the jet to lurch slightly as it left the runway. "Watch the pitch," David murmured, his hand hovering near the controls. "I've got it," Richard snapped, then instantly regretted it. "Sorry, just a bit off today." They climbed through the thick summer air, breaking through the cloud layer into the brilliant blue above. The seatbelt sign chimed off. Usually, this was the time Richard would relax, put on the autopilot, and maybe grab a coffee. Today, he sat rigid, staring at the horizon. "I'm going to use the lavatory," Richard said, after an hour of silence. "Captain, maybe you should wait," David suggested softly. "She's right there in the main cabin. I need to speak to her, David. I need to explain." "I don't think she wants an explanation, Richard. I think she wants a pilot." Richard ignored him. He unbuckled and stood up, adjusting his tie. He opened the cockpit door and stepped into the galley. Sarah was plating lunch. She looked at him with wide eyes, shaking her head slightly, warning him. Richard walked into the main cabin. Alicia was working, her laptop open, papers spread out on the conference table. She didn't look up as he approached. "Dr. Thorne," Richard said, his voice finding a semblance of its old baritone smooth. Alicia typed a few more words before stopping. She slowly turned her chair to face him. She didn't speak. She just waited. I wanted to formally apologize for the misunderstanding at the gate," Richard began, clasping his hands behind his back. "You have to understand, in this line of work, security is paramount. We get all sorts of people trying to get near these jets. I was merely exercising extreme caution to protect your property. My delivery might have been blunt, but my intentions were purely for the safety of the aircraft." Alicia stared at him. The silence stretched for 10 seconds. "You're doing it again," she said. "Doing what?" "You're excusing yourself. You aren't apologizing for insulting me. You're justifying why you did it. You're telling me that my appearance was the problem, not your bias." "No, not at all. I just meant—" "Captain Sterling," Alicia cut in, "you called me riff-raff. You assumed I was uneducated. You spoke to me like a child. That isn't security. That is arrogance. And frankly, your takeoff was sloppy. You rotated 3 knots early, and your climb profile was aggressive, likely causing unnecessary G-force for the passengers. If you are as concerned with standards as you claim to be, you should focus on your flying." Richard felt the heat rise up his neck. "I have 30 years. And I have a PhD in aerodynamics from MIT, Alicia said, picking up a pen. "And I own the company that employs you. Go back to the cockpit. Do not come back here unless the plane is on fire." Richard stood there, stripped of his dignity once again. He turned on his heel and marched back to the cockpit, slamming the door harder than necessary. "How'd it go?" David asked, not looking up from the radar. "She's a witch," Richard muttered, strapping himself back in. "A know-it-all witch. Just because she has a degree doesn't mean she knows how to fly. She knows the rotation speed, though," David noted dryly. "Shut up, David." Richard stared out the window. The Atlantic Ocean was a vast, blue sheet beneath them. He was angry now. The embarrassment had curdled into resentment. Who was she to tell him how to fly? He was Captain Sterling. He had handled emergencies she couldn't even dream of. He wished, darkly, that something would happen. Just a minor thing. Something that would require true pilot airmanship. Then she would see. Then she would realize that her books and degrees didn't mean anything when the turbulence hit. He should have been careful what he wished for. 3 hours later, halfway between New York and London, a warning chime pinged on the overhead panel. Amber light. LHYD press hello. Richard sat up straighter. Left hydraulic pressure low. Confirm, David said, his voice sharpening. Pressure is dropping fast. We have a leak. I told you, a voice came from the back of Richard's mind. She told you. Shut the valve, Richard ordered. Isolate the system. David flipped the switches. Valve closed. Pressure is still dropping. It's the primary reservoir. We're losing the blue system. Richard felt a cold spike of adrenaline. The blue hydraulic system on a Global 7500, or GD 650, powered critical flight controls, landing gear, and nose wheel steering. Losing it was bad. Losing it over the middle of the ocean was worse. We need to divert, David said. Shannon is the closest. No, Richard said, his pride overriding his logic. We can make London. We have backup systems. I'm not diverting for a minor leak. Imagine the delay. She'll fire me for sure if I strand her in Ireland. Richard, the checklist says... I know what the checklist says. We press on. The cockpit door opened. Alicia stood there. She wasn't wearing her headphones anymore. Why did the pitch trim just disengage? She asked calmly. Richard turned around, sweat beading on his forehead. We have a minor indication. It's under control. Alicia looked at the center console, her eyes darting to the hydraulic pressure gauge. It was at 0. You lost the blue system, she stated, and you haven't started a descent. Why aren't we diverting? We are continuing to London, Richard said through gritted teeth. I have redundancy. You have a leak that could affect the other systems if it's a transfer unit failure, Alicia said, her voice hard. And you have no nose wheel steering. Landing at Heathrow with crosswinds and no steering is a risk we do not take. Divert to Shannon. Now. I am the captain, Richard roared. I make the decisions. Alicia leaned into the cockpit. And I am the owner telling you that you are endangering this aircraft to save your own ego. Divert to Shannon, Captain, or I will have David fly this plane. Richard looked at David. David looked at Alicia, then at Richard. She's right, Captain, David said softly. We need to set down. Richard griped the yoke, his knuckles white. He was cornered, by the manual, by his co-pilot, and by the woman he had insulted. Fine, Richard spat, setting course for Shannon. The descent toward Shannon Airport was anything but routine. The weather in Ireland was living up to its reputation. Grey, blustery, and unforgiving. Rain lashed against the windshield of the Gulf Stream, streaking horizontally as the jet fought against the turbulence. Inside the cockpit, the atmosphere was toxic. The low hydraulic pressure warning was now accompanied by a slat flap fail message. The loss of the blue hydraulic system meant they couldn't deploy the flaps or slats hydraulically. They would have to come in fast, much faster than a standard landing. Calculate VREF plus 20, Richard barked, his voice tight. He was wrestling the yoke. Without the hydraulic dampening, the controls felt heavy and sluggish. He was physically fighting the airplane. VREF is 160 knots, David called out, his voice trembling slightly. With the flap failure, we need to hold 180 until the threshold. That's fast, Captain. That's really fast for a wet runway. I know it's fast, Richard snapped. Just get me the runway visual. Alicia was standing in the cockpit doorway. She had strapped herself into the observer's jump seat, putting on a spare headset. She hadn't asked permission. She just did it. "Captain," Alicia's voice cut through the intercom, calm and precise. "With the blue system out, you have lost nose wheel steering. You are going to have to use differential braking to keep us on the center line once we touch down. Do not attempt to use the tiller." "I know how to fly my plane," Richard shouted back, though his eyes were wide with panic. The runway lights of Shannon emerged from the gloom, swaying violently from left to right. "Wind check," David called. 260 at 25, gusting 35. It's a direct crosswind from the left. A 35-knot crosswind, in a crippled jet, coming in hot with no flaps. It was a nightmare scenario. Richard's hands were shaking. He aligned the nose with the runway, crabbing the plane into the wind. The ground rushed up to meet them at terrifying speed. Usually, a landing felt like a graceful glide. This felt like falling. "Too steep," Alicia said. "You're sinking too fast. Add power." Richard ignored her. He was fixated on the threshold. He pulled the throttle back, aiming for the numbers. "Power!" David screamed. The sink rate warning blared. "Whoop whoop, pull up!" Richard jerked the yoke back. The engine spooled up late. The jet slammed onto the tarmac with a bone-jarring crunch that felt like the strut had punched through the wing. The aircraft bounced, once, twice, before settling. "Brakes!" Richard yelled, slamming his feet on the pedals. The plane began to weathercock into the wind, the nose twisting violently to the left. Richard instinctively reached for the nose wheel tiller to steer them straight. "Don't touch the tiller!" Alicia's voice cracked like a whip. If he used the tiller with the hydraulics failed and the nose gear swiveling freely, he would shred the tires or snap the gear strut, sending them cartwheeling off the runway. Richard froze, his hand inches from the tiller. He realized she was right. He stomped on the right brake pedal, using the friction to drag the nose back to the center. The anti-skid system pulsed violently. The end of the runway was rushing towards them. "Reverse thrusters!" David shouted. "They're not engaging!" Richard panicked. "The interlock isn't releasing. Manual override," Alicia commanded. "Pull the emergency stow locks." David reached down and yanked the emergency levers. The thrust reversers roared to life, throwing buckets of air forward, slowing the screaming metal tube. They shuddered to a halt 300 feet from the grass. The cockpit was silent, save for the heavy breathing of the two pilots and the rhythmic thump-thump of the windshield wipers. The smell of burnt rubber and heated brakes seeped into the cabin. Richard slumped in his seat, his uniform drenched in sweat. He had almost killed them. He knew it. David knew it. And worst of all, she knew it. "Operations," David whispered into the radio. "N770AP is down. Requesting tug. We are unable to taxi." Alicia removed her headset. She didn't yell. She didn't celebrate. She unbuckled the jump seat harness, stood up, and smoothed out her NASA t-shirt. "Secure the aircraft, Captain," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. "Then meet me on the ramp. We're done here." The rain at Shannon Airport was cold, a stark contrast to the humid heat of Teterboro. Emergency vehicles surrounded the Gulf Stream, their blue lights flashing against the grey fuselage. A tug was slowly pulling the crippled jet toward the signature flight support FBO. Richard walked down the air stairs, his legs feeling like jelly. He tried to put on his sunglasses to hide his eyes, but the overcast sky made it look ridiculous, so he took them off. He felt naked. Alicia was already standing on the tarmac, talking to the lead mechanic from the ground crew. She was pointing at the left main landing gear, speaking in rapid-fire technical terms. "Looks like the SEAL migration blocked the return line," Alicia was saying. "Pressure built up behind the check valve and blew the primary seal. That's why we lost the fluid so fast." The mechanic, a burly Irishman named Colum, nodded respectfully. "Aye, ma'am. It's a known issue on the earlier serial numbers if the O-rings aren't swapped during the C-check. You called it right. Richard approached them. He needed to take control of the narrative. He needed to be the captain again. Well, Richard announced, forcing a hearty tone. That was a bit hairy, but any landing you can walk away from, right? I managed to wrestle her down. The crosswind was wicked, but I compensated. The mechanic looked at Richard, then back to Alicia. He sensed the tension and wisely took a step back. I'll go get the tow bar hooked up. Alicia turned to Richard. The rain dampened her braids, drops clinging to her eyelashes. She looked tired, but her eyes were burning with a cold, nuclear intensity. You managed to wrestle her down? Alicia repeated quietly. You ignored a stable approach criteria. You came in 20 knots over target. You bounced the aircraft, risking a structural failure of the spar, and you almost touched the tiller, which would have flipped us. I saved us, Richard argued, his voice rising. I made a command decision. The sensors were faulty. I used my instinct. Your instinct was to ignore the owner of the aircraft who told you about the leak before we took off, Alicia said. She stepped closer, invading his personal space. Do you remember Teterboro, Richard? Do you remember standing on those stairs, looking down at me, and telling me I didn't know anything about this machine? Richard looked away. I admitted that was a mistake. But the leak, that was a coincidence. It wasn't a coincidence, Alicia snapped. I saw the weeping strut. I told you. You dismissed it because you were too busy looking at my clothes to listen to my words. You were too busy playing God of the Sky to be a pilot. She reached into a messenger bag and pulled out a phone. Not just any phone, a satellite phone. Who are you calling? Richard asked, a knot of dread forming in his stomach. I'm calling the Director of Operations at Apex, Alicia said, and then I'm calling the FAA to file a voluntary disclosure report regarding your conduct and the safety violation of ignoring a pre-flight discrepancy. You can't do that, Richard gasped. The FAA, that will trigger an investigation. I'll lose my medical. I'll be grounded pending review. You'll ruin me. You ruined yourself when you decided your ego was heavier than the safety of my plane. Alicia dialed the number. She put the phone to her ear, her eyes never leaving his face. Marcus? She said into the phone. It's Alicia. We're in Shannon. The jet is AOG, aircraft on ground. Mechanical failure followed by pilot error during landing. She paused, listening. Richard stood there, water dripping off his nose, watching his career evaporate in real time. Yes, Alicia continued. Captain Sterling is immediately relieved of duty. He is not to touch the controls of this aircraft or any other asset in our fleet. Put him on a commercial flight back to New York in economy class. Suspend his pay, pending the formal inquiry. Economy? Richard whispered, horrified. Alicia, please, I have seniority. Alicia lowered the phone. You have nothing, Richard. You are a liability. And frankly, you're lucky I'm not suing you for the damage to the landing gear. She turned back to the phone. And Marcus? Send the backup crew from London to pick us up, and tell HR to prepare a severance package. I want to review his entire training file. I want to know how a man this arrogant slipped through our safety management system. She hung up. The silence that followed was louder than the sirens. David, the co-pilot, had come down the stairs. He stood quietly by the wing, witnessing the execution. David, Alicia said, her voice softening instantly. You did well. You called out the deviations. You tried to intervene. You are the pilot in command now. Secure the logbooks. Make sure nothing is altered. Yes, Dr. Thorne, David said, standing tall. Richard looked at David, looking for an ally, but found none. David looked at him with pity. You should have listened to her, Richard, David said softly. She wrote her thesis on hydraulic redundancy systems in business jets. She literally wrote the book on why we just crashed. Richard felt the ground sway beneath him. She wrote the thesis. I didn't know, Richard stammered. How could I know? You could have asked, Alicia said, turning to walk toward the FBO terminal. Or you could have just treated me like a human being. She stopped and looked back one last time. Enjoy the commercial flight home, Richard. I hear the middle seats are particularly educational. The journey back to New York was a masterclass in irony. Captain Richard Sterling, a man who had spent the last 15 years sipping espresso in the cockpits of $60 million jets, found himself in Terminal 3 at Heathrow, clutching a boarding pass for a commercial flight. Zone 5. Seat 42E, the middle seat. He hadn't been able to change out of his uniform. His luggage was still on the Gulf Stream in Shannon, impounded for the investigation. So, he walked through the terminal in his pilot's trousers and white shirt, though he had shamefully removed the epaulets and stuffed them into his pocket. He looked like a demoted general retreating from a lost war. As he boarded the crowded Boeing 711, the air was thick with the smell of stale coffee and humanity. A flight attendant, a woman near his own age who looked exhausted, glanced at his uniform shirt. "Deadheading back?" she asked, assuming he was a pilot hitching a ride for work. "Something like that," Richard mumbled, pushing past her. He found row 42. To his left was a teenager with her oversized backpack that encroached on Richard's legroom. To his right was a mother with an infant who was already screaming before the doors had even closed. Richard squeezed into the middle seat, his knees pressed against the plastic tray table in front of him. He closed his eyes, trying to disassociate from reality. Just 24 hours ago, he was standing on the tarmac at Teterboro, the king of his domain, sneering at a woman in a NASA t-shirt. "I don't fly backpackers," he had said. Now, he was literally rubbing shoulders with them. The flight was 8 hours of torture. The baby screamed for 5 of them. The teenager fell asleep and drooled on Richard's shoulder. When the meal service came, a sad, foil-wrapped tray of pasta, Richard stared at it, remembering the caviar and Dom Perignon chilling in the galley of the Gulf Stream. He had plenty of time to think. At first, his mind was filled with righteous indignation. "She's overreacting," he told himself. It was a judgment call. I'm a veteran. The Union will back me up. But as the hours dragged on, and the turbulence rattled the plastic cabin walls, a colder, harder truth began to settle in. He replayed the landing in Shannon, the speed, the bounce, the urge to grab the tiller. He knew, deep down in the place where pilots keep their true fears, that she was right. He had been scared. He had been behind the airplane. And he had ignored a critical warning because he couldn't bear to admit the girl in the hoodie knew more than he did. By the time the plane touched down at JFK, Richard wasn't angry anymore. He was hollow. He took a cab to the Apex Aviation headquarters in Manhattan. It was a Sunday evening, but he had been summoned. The email he received when he landed was brief. Mandatory debriefing. Podseita, 6 p.m., Boardroom B. He walked into the glass and steel lobby of the Apex building. The security guard, a man Richard had walked past 100 times without acknowledging, looked up. "ID, please," the guard said. "It's me, Frank, Captain Sterling." "I know who you are, sir," the guard said, his face impassive. "I still need to scan your ID. Protocol." Richard handed over his badge. The scanner beeped red. "Access denied." The guard looked up, a flicker of something. Was it pity in his eyes? "I have to issue you a visitor pass, sir. You've been scrubbed from the system." Richard felt his stomach drop. It was happening fast. He took the sticky paper badge that said, "Visitor," and pasted it onto his wrinkled white shirt. He took the elevator up to the 40th floor. The hallway was silent. The lights were dimmed, except for the conference room at the end of the hall. He pushed the heavy glass doors open. The elevator ride to the 40th floor felt less like an ascent and more like a pressurized dive. Richard watched the floor numbers tick upward, 38, 39, 40. And with each chime, his heart hammered a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He adjusted his tie for the 10th time. It was a cheap clip-on he had bought at the airport gift shop because he couldn't bear to wear the uniform without the epaulets. But now, seeing his reflection in the polished brass doors, he realized he looked exactly like what he was, a man in a costume. The doors slid open. The executive floor of Apex Aviation was usually a place of hushed reverence, carpeted in deep navy wool and smelling of fresh lilies. Tonight, the silence felt predatory. A receptionist Richard had known for 5 years, a woman he usually winked at on his way to collect his per diem, sat behind the glass desk. She didn't look up. "I'm here for the meeting," Richard said, his voice sounding thin in the cavernous lobby. "Boardroom B." "They are waiting for you, Mr. Sterling," she said, her eyes fixed on her screen. She didn't call him captain. The omission hit him like a physical slap. Richard walked down the long corridor. The walls were lined with framed photographs of the company's fleet, the G650s, the Global 7500s, the Challengers. He was in 3 of those photos. He wondered how long it would take for them to be taken down. He reached the heavy double doors of Boardroom B. He took a breath, summoned the ghost of his old arrogance, and pushed them open. The temperature inside dropped instantly. It was clinically cold, the air conditioning humming with a low, aggressive drone. The room was vast, dominated by a 20-foot mahogany table that gleamed under the harsh, recessed lighting. At the far end, silhouetted against the floor-to-ceiling windows that showcased the Manhattan skyline, sat the tribunal. Alicia Thorne was in the center seat. The transformation was absolute. The vintage NASA t-shirt and cargo pants were gone. In their place, she wore a tailored slate-gray suit that screamed executive power. Her braids were pulled back into an intricate, severe bun, highlighting the sharp line of her jaw. She didn't look like a mechanic or an engineer today. She looked like a judge. To her right was Marcus, the VP of Operations. He was staring at a point on the table, refusing to meet Richard's eyes. To her left sat a woman Richard didn't recognize, a corporate attorney with a laptop open and a stack of files that looked ominously thick. And in the corner, sitting in a folding chair like an afterthought, was David. "Take a seat, Mr. Sterling," Alicia said. Her voice was quiet, devoid of the warmth or curiosity she had shown on the tarmac. It was the voice of a machine. Richard pulled out the chair at the opposite end of the table. The distance between them felt like a mile. "Dr. Thorne." "Marcus." "Look, I know emotions are high after the diversion. I am prepared to debrief the incident. I have my notes regarding the wind shear and the sensor malfunctions." "There were no sensor malfunctions," Alicia said, cutting him off before he could open his folder. "We pulled the raw data from the FDR, Flight Data Recorder, an hour ago. The sensors were reading perfectly. The hydraulic pressure was 0 because the fluid was gone. The fluid was gone because the seal failed. The seal failed because, as I told you at Teterboro, it was degraded." "It was a judgment call," Richard insisted, leaning forward. In the heat of the moment. "This isn't a debriefing, Richard," Marcus spoke up, his voice weary. "This is a termination hearing." Richard froze. He looked at Marcus, searching for the camaraderie they had built over 10 years of company barbecues and golf outings. Termination. Marcus, come on. For a diversion, I landed the plane. Nobody got a scratch. You can't fire a senior captain with 30 years of experience for saving the aircraft. We aren't firing you for the diversion, the lawyer interjected, looking up from her screen. We are firing you for gross negligence, insubordination, and violation of the safety management system. She slid a document down the long, polished table. It spun slowly and stopped directly in front of Richard. It was a transcript. We listened to the CVR, cockpit voice recorder, Alicia said, her eyes boring into him. Do you know what the most frightening part of that recording was, Richard? It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the alarms. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table. It was the silence. The silence when your first officer warned you about the speed. The silence when I warned you about the tiller. You were so busy filtering out the voices you didn't respect, David because he's young, and me because I'm a woman, that you went deaf to reality. I am the captain. Richard slammed his hand on the table, unable to contain the defensive rage bubbling up. By maritime and aviation law, I am the final authority on that vessel. I don't take orders from passengers, regardless of who owns the pink slip. And that, Alicia said calmly, is why you will never fly again. She gestured to David. Captain David, please read the transcript from the landing roll. Richard whipped his head around. Captain David, he's a kid. He's a first officer. David stood up. He looked pale, but his jaw was set. He looked at Richard, not with fear this time, but with a profound, pitying disappointment. At timestamp 14:05, David read from the paper, his voice steady. Captain Sterling attempted to reach for the nosewheel tiller. I shouted, reverse thrusters. Dr. Thorne shouted, don't touch the tiller. Captain Sterling's hand was on the control. If he had turned it, the nose gear would have snapped, and the aircraft would have cartwheeled into the fuel farm. I didn't turn it, Richard shouted. I corrected with brakes. Only because I yelled at you, Alicia said. You hesitated. In this business, a hesitation born of ego is a death sentence. Alicia opened a second file folder. Let's talk about the cost of your ego, Richard. Because you seem to think this is just about feelings. The landing gear strut on N770AP is twisted, she listed, ticking off items on her fingers. The tires are shredded, the brakes are fused. The structural inspection alone will cost $200,000. The downtime for the aircraft is 3 weeks. That's a loss of charter revenue of approximately $1.2 million. Richard swallowed hard. The numbers were staggering. But we can absorb the money, Alicia continued. What we cannot absorb is the liability of employing a man who thinks his tenure outweighs physics. The lawyer cleared her throat. Mr. Sterling, under Article 4, Section 2 of your employment contract, willful misconduct voids your severance package. It voids your stock options. It voids your accumulative flight benefits. Richard felt the blood drain from his face. My stock options? I have $500,000 in unvested Apex stock. That's my retirement. It was your retirement, the lawyer corrected. It has been clawed back as of 5 p.m. today to cover the damages to the aircraft. You can't do that, Richard whispered, his voice trembling. He looked at Marcus. Marcus, tell them. I have a mortgage. I have alimony. Marcus looked down at his hands. You signed the contract, Richard. And frankly, after what you said on the recorder, about Alicia, I can't protect you. I don't want to. Richard looked back at Alicia. He saw the NASA t-shirt in his mind again, the woman he had dismissed as a backpacker. He realized now that she hadn't just been a passenger. She had been a test he had failed in spectacular fashion. Alicia, Richard said, his voice cracking. He dropped the formal titles. He was just a desperate man now. Please, ground me for a month. Send me to retraining. Don't end it like this. Flying is all I have. Alicia stood up. She walked slowly down the length of the table. The clicking of her heels was the only sound in the room. She stopped next to his chair, looking down at him. He felt small, shrunken. You don't love flying, Richard, she said softly. You love being important. You love the uniform. You love the way people look at you when you walk through the terminal. She placed a white envelope on the table in front of him. This is your FAA Section 804 report, she said. I've filed a formal complaint against your medical certificate regarding your cognitive fitness and CRM capabilities. It details your refusal to acknowledge critical safety warnings due to verified bias. It will follow you to every airline, every charter company, and every cargo hauler in the world. You're blacklisting me, Richard gasped. No, Alicia said, leaning in close. I'm grounding you. I am ensuring that no one else has to sit in a metal tube at 40,000 feet with a man who thinks he knows better than the machine and the people who built it. She straightened up and turned to the security guards waiting by the door. Escort Mr. Sterling to the exit. Take his badge. Ensure he does not access the crew lounge. Richard stood up, his legs feeling like lead. He reached for the envelope, the tombstone of his career. He looked at David one last time. You stabbed me in the back, kid, Richard spat. David met his gaze, his eyes hard. No, Richard. I just stopped you from crashing us. There's a difference. Richard turned to Alicia. He wanted to say something hurtful, something to restore a shred of his dignity. But looking at her, this brilliant, powerful black woman who had outflown him, outsmarted him, and now outmaneuvered him, he realized he had no ammunition left. Goodbye, Richard, Alicia said finality. Check the gate next time. Richard walked out of the room. The walk down the hallway felt endless. The photos of the jets seemed to mock him. He reached the elevator, the guard stripping the badge from his belt loop before he stepped in. As the doors closed, cutting off his view of the world he used to rule, Richard Sterling saw his own reflection in the metal again. He looked old. He looked tired. And for the first time in 30 years, he looked like a passenger. And that is the story of how Captain Richard Sterling learned that the help he insulted was actually the only person who could save his life, and the person who would ultimately end his career. It's a brutal reminder that arrogance is the most dangerous co-pilot you can have. Richard judged Alicia by her hoodie and her skin color, failing to see the brilliant engineer and CEO standing right in front of him. In the end, he didn't lose his job just because of a mistake. He lost it because he refused to listen, and because he believed his status made him invincible to consequences. Karma didn't just hit him, it retired him. What would you have done if you were Alicia? Was stripping his pension too harsh, or was it exactly the justice he deserved for endangering lives? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story of justice served at 40,000 feet, please smash that like button. It really helps the channel grow. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a story. We post new dramas every week. Thanks for watching, and fly safe.